hop into it.
All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Talk Junkies. Today is the 30th of March?
31st.
31st. Okay. And we have a special guest on today, Mike Anderson. Thank you for joining the show, man. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Anytime, man. So we have a small subscriber base. We're at 125 subs right now. We're slowly growing, man. We're making our way up, and we're glad to have you on the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a IT guy by profession and a history lover by hobby, I guess is a way to put it. I've always loved history. I've written about it. You guys know that I started a blog in 2008 to write about ancient history because I'm fascinated by it. But I also love, modern history, American history, the constitutional period, all very interesting to me. And I use that in the books I write because history is an important backdrop to everything that happens in the present, because history brought us to where we are today.
I was actually looking at your blog post, the one about the, the something gene, the book that you had come out a couple of years ago?
The progressive gene. Right?
Yeah, and I was like, that's actually really interesting.
Yeah, that's my first book.
And you can find these books on Amazon, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I'd have to check it out. I actually saw a few of them there I saw one of them on there on Amazon for like $40. I'm gonna have to purchase that.
What's kind of the overview on the progressive gene? I'm curious.
Well, the books I'm writing are really about contemporary American politics. They're not about history, although the history becomes an important part of the current day, as you know. Progressive gene, I got the idea for that book from a professor at New York University named Jonathan Haidt, and he published a book in 2012 called The Righteous Mind. And the point of that book was that, with all the political arguing we have in our country today, the right and the left both take the position that the other is wrong. And what Haidt's research showed, and the research of others, is there's no such thing as a right and wrong morality. There's different points of view that people have that justify their position, and that those positions may be different than other people and still be right. And the main thing about Haidt's work, among others, is to understand that there's a genetic component to personality and to morality. So part of what you believe morally is ingrained and you were born with. And then that gets added to by, your experience growing up into adulthood. But Haidt broke the foundations of morality down into 6 different categories: caring, fairness, authority, loyalty, sanctity, and liberty. And so every person has a different mixture of those characteristics, and you can graph them. And it's interesting to graph them versus the political spectrum, where you have the left on the left and the right on the right and independence in the middle, but the graphs describe the characteristics of people on the left as very different from people on the right.
Now, are those like the absolute essential? Like every person who's ever lived, has those 6 like different branches of morality. Basically, it's just like and how they take it. Like that's how they broke it down.
Yes. And
very interesting.
And the people on the left, what's interesting about it is people on the left, and when you hear these things, you really understand the political points of view. People on the left have very strong feelings about caring and fairness. So they worry about the disadvantaged, and they worry about unfairness, inequality. Why are there rich and poor, and why can't everybody be, have equal money and equal wealth? So that's on the left. And on the right, the morality is more complicated. People on the right are less interested in caring and fairness, not that they aren't, but those two compete with other beliefs that the right has about loyalty and authority. Like people on the right, they're conservative, tend to respect authority. They also tend to be more patriotic and loyal. So you can kind of see how, you look at the way conservatives behave and think, and it kind of fits that. And you look at how progressives and liberals think, and it kind of fits the caring and fairness side. So it's interesting because this must have existed in the ancient world too. People have always had these characteristics, and it's interesting to speculate how that would have worked out in human society back then.
Do you almost think it's important to have that duality between the two sides for a society? Like maybe it's almost necessary to have, that it shouldn't just be so one-sided on that, but it's necessary to
No, I think you're absolutely right. Conservatives need liberals to kick them in the butt to move the world forward, and liberals need conservatives to slow them down because they have a lot of crazy ideas.
I was going to say the big thing I read from your synopsis about the book, the part that I found most interesting, besides the fact that it's just genetically encoded in us, is it makes complete sense that like liberals have a part of their brain that is it likes change and it likes different things and new stuff moving forward kind of thing, and then conservatives have the fight or flight and the risk management kind of side of things already ingrained in their brain on a genetic level. And I never thought about that before, but it makes complete sense.
Well, listen to this. They've actually done studies where they've analyzed with brain stimulation human response to images or sounds or words, and they could tell which parts of the brains are stimulated. And what they found is that there's the part of the brain that does fight or flight is called the amygdala. It's an organ, basically. It's a section of the brain. And conservatives have a more developed amygdala than liberals do, which may mean, and this is not for certain, but it may mean that conservatives are more careful because they have a more complex view at what to do about a certain situation. So they may be more conservative because they're more careful. Whereas another part of the brain that liberals have a more developed part of is the enjoyment of the new. In other words, more risk taking. It's well documented that progressive people like to travel. They like to go to other countries. They like to explore. They like new things. So these are some interesting differences. And of course, we're talking about in an extreme the people at each end. People in the middle, that you would call classically independents and independent voters would have some combination of all these characteristics that sort of balance out. So, but then if we look at the ancient world, for example, think about a tribe of humans of 100, an egalitarian band, and you got to have the same mix of traits there. So, you've got the progressives who are anxious to go hunt, and the conservatives who want to be careful and not get eaten on the hunt, so they'll, have a more conservative point of view toward that.
I'm curious.
So if you had, if the tribe had all progressives or all conservatives, neither one would survive, to answer your question, because the progressives would all go out and do crazy stuff and get killed, and the conservatives wouldn't do anything. They probably wouldn't find any food because they would never venture out. And I'm giving you an extreme case. I'm carrying it to a ridiculous example, but you get what I mean.
Absolutely. Now, as far as our day and age, I feel as though there is a lot of backlash that both sides, between liberal and conservative, to where there's this dislike. I feel, because that's very prevalent in our society, I think more people need to hear things like that and maybe have a little bit more respect for the other side, at the fact that it's necessary to coexist and be cordial with each other and not have so much hatred toward one side just because there is opposing views. I think this is important for people to hear, for sure.
Yep. Well, I'm just finishing my second book, which is called Tribalism, The Curse of the 21st Century America. And it's all about tribalism. We're in a tribal state because both the right and the left have gravitated toward an ideology that is radically opposed to the other. And the people that used to live in the middle have now gravitated to one side or the other, and there is no middle. So what you're describing is really, the state of the country since perhaps 2000.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, growing up and just in the 90s, being young and stuff like that, I don't know. I mean, it just makes sense that in the early 2000s is when it developed. I mean, just watching the news and watching how it progresses to the way it has, just leaning one way super right and then one way super left, I mean, that's just what I've noticed.
Nope, it's definitely there.
Media probably fuels a lot of that fire too. I have a feeling.
Well, that's what happens when you have conservative media outlets and liberal media outlets. And you even said it earlier, Jesse, that like for some reason right now in society there's this hatred amongst them. People are like, I've seen posts on the internet where liberals are like, oh, all conservatives can go die, or vice versa, conservatives being like, oh, those liberals can go die. Like, I mean, when in all reality we should just like get along and have different viewpoints, and that's cool.
And that it's actually beneficial in the end. And that's, what Mike was getting down to. It's very interesting.
Well, I mean, again, this is in my second book, but it starts, I talk about the chronology that started in 2000, and the first, and this is not an absolutely correct analysis of it, but it's my view. Like, it started with the 2000 election when there was all that controversy over who won. And so Bush was elected president based on the vote recount in Florida. So the Democrats felt like they got robbed. Their guy got elected, but it got stolen from them.
Well, the Electoral College has always been a thing with elections, and I know it's weird that it can work out to where you can win the popular vote but not win the Electoral College, but that's what the actual presidency is based off of.
Yep. But then, after that election, then we had 9/11 the next year, which was very traumatic for the country. And it really brought the country together. I mean, it glued us all together because events like that bring humanity together for a single purpose. And if tomorrow something happened like that, God forbid, we would all come together again because we would look at this arguing as stupid because it's not as important as life. So we had 9/11, then we had the Iraq War, then we had the Afghan War, all that stuff. Then we had the real estate crash. And so, a sequence of events has, fragmented the country. A big part of it is the makeup of the Congress has changed. There used to be senators and representatives in the middle who were the guys the people that helped compromise to get laws passed, and all those middle people are all gone. The people that are elected now are all in the extreme.
Well, why is that?
I don't know exactly. I mean, the people who I don't know. I guess people that had more, strongly ideological views were the ones that were running, and the people who sought compromise retired.
That makes sense. So they're basically just more adamant about being conservative, or more adamant about being liberal, and those are the people that are in office now. It's not people closer to the center, like a mix of the two.
Right. People also vote on extremes, though.
This is true.
You have people. I mean, you're gonna vote for the boring person who's probably right about everybody and has the best out for everybody, or are you gonna vote for like the firecracker? That's
yeah.
Well, you could have a 2-hour podcast on voting and why people vote and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, it's a battle throughout history, starting in the ancient history times, about what power do the people have a right to have? Because On the one hand, if the people exercise the vote, then they're controlling who gets elected. So they have control over their government. On the other hand, if they don't pay attention or they're not educated and they don't vote for the right people, what value does that vote have? So, we have a representative democracy, or it's actually a republic, where we elect people to represent us that are supposed to be smarter than we are about the issues and run the government. So,
yeah, and that's not the case. We had AOC, I don't know how to say her name correctly, but she was a bartender last year in New York, and now she is a representative in the House, and she's just spreading like wildfire, on the left. So,
like I said, extremist.
Yeah,
and popularity. That's what people vote on these days.
And
well, it's interesting what's happening in the Democratic Party, because it is going to go through the same battle the Republican Party did in 2008 when the Tea Party got started. The Republican Party broke into parts, and it's not really back together again. But the Democrats are still fighting to get rid of Hillary. I mean, she'd like to run again, but there's generations younger than her that look at, the Clintons as the past, and they need to start over and get somebody younger and fresher with new ideas as a candidate. So, but you can see how they're fighting. They have this Green
New Deal.
Green New Deal, which is amazing that someone would ever think of it. But it's a very extreme position, but some of the candidates have endorsed it. I mean, you guys have read about it, right?
Yeah, I've read slightly into it, just trying to get rid of, in a 10-year span, I believe, they're trying to get rid of all vehicles and limit flying and stuff like that. And majority of people they want to get rid of fossil fuels is what the Green New Deal is.
They want to get rid of all fossil fuels in 10 years is the target.
Technology doesn't progress that way.
No airplanes, no boats, no trains, only electric cars.
Would you say that's almost like they're trying to push to get into like the third industrial revolution, basically, and come out of the one that we're in right now?
Yeah. Well, I think that makes sense. Yeah, they're well, I don't know. The left has always come up with extreme ideas because they're idealistic. They're more idealistic than the right, in my opinion. And I mean, part of that is noble because they worry about the downtrodden and the poor and the disadvantaged. The problem is that their focus is too narrow on those groups and not wide enough on the rest of their belief system. So
when did it all start? I mean, not like in the United States in particular, but like you said, when it comes to ancient times, was it not in Rome? Is that when it started?
What started?
Like the left versus right, or that similar style.
Well, the Greeks and Romans had factions. They're always political factions, remember, because if you've got these personality traits that are foundational in us, then there's always going to be people who put caring and fairness above loyalty and authority. So any society is going to have that opposition. The Romans had the Senate, and the Senate was the conservative, rich, patrician landholders. And the plebeians were the common man who weren't rich and were workers, basically. So the Roman Republic is an interesting story because it was the Senate as opposed to the people for the first 220 years of the Republic's existence. The plebs lobbied for more power, and the Senate gave them more power gradually over time, so that 200 years later, they had almost the same power as the Senate. So, but then it tipped the other way. Then the power of the Senate was weakened by poor decisions, and the people got stronger, and the people got attached to the army, and the army changed its form. The army formerly was a citizen army of farmers, then it became an army of professionals. And when it did that, it became loyal to the general. So more loyal to the general than the republic. So that's when people like Caesar could take control because he had an army nobody else did.
I know this is going to be off topic, but have you seen the movie The Gladiator?
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
How accurate is The Gladiator? I just got to ask real quick, since you're the history buff. I want to hear that this is actually how it was, but I want to get your opinion. How accurate is Gladiator with Russell Crowe?
It's very accurate, but Commodus, who is the emperor who strangled his father, that was Marcus Aurelius. It isn't known whether he really did that, and he really was a jerk like that. I mean, he was a bad person. He was assassinated, not killed in the arena by the gladiator.
Damn, because that would have been awesome.
but I mean, Marcus Aurelius, I mean, he was portrayed correctly. The battles in the beginning of Germania were portrayed correctly. Commodus had a sister, and then their son, Lucius Verus, was actually, there was a real Lucius Verus. Well, the boy in the picture was the son of Lucius Verus Sr., who was Marcus Aurelius's co-emperor. There were two emperors then, but Lucius Verus died of disease while on a foreign campaign, leaving Marcus Aurelius as the only emperor. So the story is, pretty accurate, but not exact, embroidered a little bit for Hollywood, but
as I figured. No, but that makes me happy to know that that's actually historically accurate, because that's one of my more favorite movies too. I've seen that movie a bunch of times. That's an amazing film.
Yep.
Another question for you: since you you probably know in depth enough to know how these civilizations have fallen and everything like that, is there any things that worry you about today in our politics and our government or anything that almost kind of worry you? These are, early warning signs of the failures of these previous cultures or anything like that.
Like the whole history repeats itself.
Yeah, history
what would he
repeats
know
itself
about the past?
Yeah.
Right. I hesitate. I'm going to answer, but I hesitate in answering because even though we can pull a lot of useful information out of history, it's not a good predictor. Because we can't say, well, Rome, took 100 years for the Republic to fall into an empire, and so looks like we're halfway through that with the United States. When you look at great civilizations over history, there is a very simple reason the ones that failed, and that is they failed to govern. It's as simple as that. So their government organization failed. They failed to manage an economic environment that allowed people to prosper. They were defeated in battle and destroyed. So it's really about the health of the government. And if a government is healthy and is able to care for its culture or allow its culture to prosper, it can survive. Now, modern nations, the nation state didn't really exist like we have them now till about 1850. So it's only been 150 years that we've had countries. Before that was empires. So, and the United States was really the first, liberal democracy in the world, followed by France. So it isn't a very old experiment. So it's hard to see the analogy at work. I can say that I have a concern when our government doesn't work, it isn't good. And it's been deadlocked for probably since Obama got elected. We're working on 11 years it's been deadlocked. And so problems don't get solved like Medicare and Social Security and the healthcare system. They just, Medicare and Social Security eventually will go bankrupt. So theoretically, somebody will try and fix that later. But in the meantime, they just go farther and farther into debt. And the country goes farther and farther into debt. So
is that an issue that the Romans had, was being in debt? Or
yes, sure. Yeah, I mean, the Republic fell because a tyrant with an army overran the country. But the people, it started when the people reacted against poverty, because there were no, people starving and nobody was doing anything about it. Because there was no welfare then. There was no Social Security then. There was no Medicare then. There's no medical health. There was no, governments then did not provide any services to people. So
I'm trying to think here about. So, go ahead, Jesse. Sorry.
No,
I'm looking at my notes.
I know we're kind of bouncing around and not really staying on one topic. I had another question for you as far as hermeneutics goes, and when it comes to like the translation of language to language, and how that affects, or do you think it affects like how we interpret history from the past? Because it's obviously best to speak that language and then understand it with that mind. Like, Romans back in the day, speaking in their language, they have the best understanding of what was being said and written. Like, is information lost over time that you can never kind of grasp because of that that transition from language to language and interpretation?
Very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. I mean, I read mainly scholarly documents by academics, and there are people who, anybody that has a classics degree, it studies ancient history, usually knows Latin and Greek. They've been trained on both. So if you know Latin and Greek and you're reading like about, the Greek society and the Athens and all that in Greek, then you're not losing anything. I guess the question is, when that gets translated into English, then what happens?
Yeah, like if you lose a certain percentage of the actual, maybe something that they were trying to get across that now has to be worded differently because language is so different, and maybe you're not getting 100% of the picture like somebody who's actually able to read it in Latin, kind of thing.
Well, I guess the answer is, to any of us who read a translated document will lose stuff. There's no, because there are words in any given language that don't exist in other languages. Special meanings, idioms, words that are unique, that there's no translation for. So, and it's particularly true in the arts. There's a famous Russian poet named Pushkin who lived in the early 1800s. He's a hero to the Russian people. They say that no English translation of his works is readable or valuable because you don't understand. You don't get it.
Yep.
Was one of the very first languages or ever written languages, was that Mesopotamia?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And what was that? How did they write it, and how was it transcripted for people to be able to read?
I don't know a lot about it. I don't know whether it's even called a language. They certainly had writing because they had accountants, and they found on tablets writings of, we had 10 acres of wheat harvested, all that, because the earliest Mesopotamian government was a theocracy. So priests ran the government, and the priests had control over the storehouse of the harvested grain. So they had accountants that kept track of everything. And so we have all those artifacts. I don't know a lot about the Mesopotamian language itself. compared to others. That's all I can say.
So I have one more question I have multiple more questions, but one question that stood out to me when I was just looking up some questions to ask you. And what happened to the imperial archives that were stored in ancient Rome? I think it was called tabular. I don't know how to say that. Sorry.
The tabularium.
Yeah, the tabularium. Yeah.
Nobody knows. They disappeared. So probably, I mean, to understand what happened to Rome, part of it is understanding the impact of the Catholic Church, because when Rome fell, the Roman Forum, which was the center of the Roman civil government, contained all the famous buildings, like the Senate House is there, for example, and the Tabularium is there. I've been there. And when Rome fell, when the Roman Empire fell, Rome became a Catholic community because it was part of it was the center of the Catholic Church, because St. Peter's is there, and it was the center of power of the Catholic Church. So no one cared to preserve anything that was Roman because it was pagan. Because the Romans were pagan. They worshipped idols and burned their dead. They didn't bury them. So they were sinful and corrupt in the eyes of the Catholic Church. So there was a lot of marble and structures destroyed in the Forum where the materials were hauled off and made into churches, because the Forum was not valuable. It was seen as a decadent culture.
So was it mainly like government documents and stuff like that, or was it? No,
I'm talking about, things like building materials mainly. Like, we don't know where the government documents went.
Okay.
They could have been, they were written on parchment or paper or something, probably might have been all burned. I don't know.
I was going to say, I'm sure that they could be destroyed as well, simply because if you have, a Catholic, society or religion coming in there and whatnot, and then being like, if they legitimately didn't care about the Romans' history or the, their religion and paganism and all this different stuff, then why would they care to not burn it? You know what I mean? Like, they could just get rid of it all. They're not thinking of the future and what other people are going to see and whatnot. I mean, history is written by the victor.
So what other like when you read Roman documents, or like what kind of documents are you able to read or find from that time?
Well, there's a lot of published Roman, literature and history. I mean, there's some famous Roman historians. Pliny was one, and Livy, Livy. He wrote the history of the Second Punic War against Hannibal. So I have those. Cicero, the famous orator, a lot of his works survive, his famous speeches. And it's interesting because some Roman documents that were written on paper survived to the Middle Ages, and monks wrote the Bible on the back of each piece of paper because they were short of paper. So since that was the only paper available, they used it to write religious works on. But, there's a lot of Rome that survived. What I'm, saying when I say destroyed, it would be things like accounting, details about what life was like, how much money was taken in, how much money was spent on what. We have another great example of what we have is Caesar's commentaries and Caesar's conquest of Gaul. He wrote those books himself, and we have the complete books. So
it's not like anything was destroyed that left a big hole in history to where there's this mystery now of like what happened and things like that. Like everything's very well provable, and you're able to piece that together and everything. There's no holes or anything.
No, there's a lot of holes. Because Livy wrote 35 volumes and like 22 disappeared. So all we have is 13. So he wrote the complete history of Rome. So all those missing volumes are holes. Now, there are other historians too that wrote books, but there are many, many holes.
And I'm sure contradictions as well amongst the historians, just because, it's just human account, and it's, changes from person to person very easily. But
Well, the first real historian, was basically Herodotus, who was Greek, and he lived in about, I think about he's born 420 BC or something and lived to 350 BC. And so he wrote about the Battle of Thermopylae and all that. So he's the only record we have for 300. But since he was the first historian, there were no rules. Basically, he went around, talked to people, and wrote down what he heard and sort of put everything together himself. He has some things in there that are sort of, I don't know, either idealistic or magical, or, things that wouldn't be accepted today, because today you would do research and get all the facts you could and write what the facts are. So
I feel like that's oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, we don't blame Herodotus because there was nobody before him. There were no historians. There were no, how did he know what the right way to do it was?
That's what I was going to say. Is I feel like it's a good thing that there's so many today. There's humans err. You know what I mean? So when you have one person recording history, and there's going to be flaws there and whatnot, as to where now we have so many people focusing on it that even if one individual is flawed, you have multiple people coming together to like piece stuff together, so they realize like, no, you're probably wrong about this account because the other 39 people saw it this way, kind of thing.
Yeah, well, let me give an example that I mentioned Caesar's conquest of Gaul, which I have and I read, and you guys would enjoy reading it too. But somebody asked me a question on Quora. Why do you believe that Caesar was telling the truth rather than just bragging? Good question. But the answer is all his generals that were with him witnessed what he wrote down. So he couldn't make it up, because he would have been ridiculed like crazy if he put down things that weren't true to make himself look big.
So he had accountability. Like there was accountability there.
Because those published when he was done with them.
His peers, yes.
Very interesting.
What would you say is the most important historical document that there is?
Wow. Well, if you're Christian, you'd say the Bible, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Other than that, I mean, there's some classic examples. The Magna Carta, because it was signed in 1215, so it kind of created the concept of modern government. The Rosetta Stone, you guys know what that is?
Yes.
Okay. Rosetta Stone is, without that, no one would understand Egyptian hieroglyphics. So it unlocked the understanding of the history of Egypt. I don't know, examples like that. I guess the Roman example would be the Justinian Code, which is basically a set of laws that the Emperor Justinian wrote down that were, he put them together and organized them. And that set of laws became the laws of Europe from like 500 all the way through, the Enlightenment. Because the basic premise of those laws was that the emperor is God's chosen one. It fused the political leader with the church. So then after that, of course, all the kings of Europe were blessed by the Pope, and they received power from the Pope. And so that's pretty important. But can't think of any others right now.
How important was it in history to kind of have a separation from religion and politics? Like that's obviously a progressive thing, but I'm trying to think of where I was exactly going with that question.
Like in the Roman times, did they separate church from state?
Yes. But let me take you back. You made me think of something. Let's go all the way back to human history. The first human organization was in bands, not tribes, but bands, BANDS. And those are groups of 50 to 150 human beings. That's man's original organization. And when man started, that organization was hierarchical, meaning the tough, strong guys were the leaders. But that didn't last too long, because when man started using his brain and invented weapons, then the wimpiest guy in the tribe could kill the leader with a spear. So then it evolved into an egalitarian society, which means everybody was basically equal. And that's the model all the way up to Mesopotamia, because man was a nomad and lived in bands and traveled from place to place to find food. It didn't make sense to have a larger organization than that. But when groups of bands form together, they form tribes. Like we think of Native American tribes, those are groups of bands that work together. And the difference between a band and a tribe is a tribe has a medicine man. It has a spiritual healer separate from the chief. So I'm answering your question about the separation of church and state, because that's the original form of it. Because there needs someone to be the manager of the people and the government, and there needs someone to manage the relationship with God. So when Rome started, it had kings, and the king was also the chief priest. Okay? But when the kings were overthrown and the republic started, this was 509 BC, the Roman people said, we're not going to have our government leaders be our spiritual leaders. So they created a new position called the Pontifex Maximus. And that person was the religious leader of the Roman people. And then separately, there were the magistrates that ran the country, that ran the Roman Republic, were called consuls, C-O-N-S-U-L, and there were two of them elected. And so they ran the civil government, and the Pontifex Maximus managed the religious part of the republic. Now, when our country was founded, the founders tried to make a copy of the Roman Republic. They knew the Greek democracy could not work, but they thought the Roman Republic might work. So in the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, they debated what the government should be like. And for a while, they were going to have two presidents, just like Rome. But that eventually got vetoed, and they selected only one, because they thought if there were two presidents, they would fight all the time and cancel each other out, and nothing would get done. So that's how Rome translated, part of how Rome translated into our form of government.
Is that why there's still like a lot of Latin involved? Like a courthouse will have like a seal,
Yep.
of an eagle, and it'll be like Latin underneath it, and even on the dollar bill.
Yep.
Well, I felt like America in general has a very Roman kind of side of things with, capitalism and everything that we are is all came from Rome for the most part. As far as I know, Mike's here to...
No, you're right. Our laws, our American law is Roman law. European law is Roman law. So, and think about it. Back in the Romans were an extremely methodical and organized people. Very, great engineering and design, and their roads made 3,000 years ago, you can still drive on. They didn't fall apart. But when you think about the fact that they had to invent law, and let me give you an example. You own a sword and your neighbor steals it. Well, now you would either accuse him of theft and take him to court or sue him or something like that. What do you do when there's no such thing as property? Because when the Republic started, there was no such thing as property. If you had something in your possession, it was yours. So the whole concept of property had to be invented, and laws put around that property that governed who had possession of it and how to prove, write a contract, People sign it. I sold it to you, and now it's yours. But before Rome, there was none. That didn't exist.
I mean, I guess part of that probably comes with record keeping and everything else too, because there's gonna be stuff on paper or on file that, like, if I were to come in here and just kick Paul, I kick you and Carrie Ann and Phoenix and stuff out of your house, and then I'm just like, this is my house now. Fight me back for it. You can just go to the courts because there's like documents and stuff that show that you own this house.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have everything to attribute to the Romans. That's pretty good stuff.
In your opinion, why is it that, and I don't know as much about, the only thing that I know about as far as like Greek kind of stuff goes is more on the like the mythology side. I don't actually know anything about like the Greek government, but why is the Roman government and Roman like capitalism and everything like that what flourished and moved on compared to like the Greek side of things? Because I didn't realize they were that different, to be honest.
They're enormously different. The Greeks were thinkers and scientists and artists and mathematicians and philosophers. The Romans were lousy at all those things. They were engineers, basically. They thought practically. The Greeks thought theoretically. So the Greeks, we probably owe more to the Greeks than the Romans. Not the Greek form of government, but the Greek everything else.
Like science and ideology and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, Plato and Aristotle influence Western civilization up to today because they were so brilliant, and the way they describe the world has not been really replaced. But then you have, the dramatists, the poets, mathematicians, Euclid, invented geometry, and Hippocrates with medicine. The Greeks were thinkers. They invented, until the Greek polis civilization existed, there was no such thing as taking time to think. People got up early in the morning, had breakfast, went to work, came home, had dinner, and went to bed. That was it. There was no, and anybody that was sitting around thinking was not only wasting time, but they were unproductive and they were lazy. But at some point, as the Greek civilization developed, the Greek people started to value thinking. And so they allowed people to do it. People became philosophers. They listened to their philosophy. They tried to incorporate that in their government. So they went this whole different direction than Rome did. And the Romans admired the Greeks greatly. They were, they brought Greek tutors to Rome to teach their kids. They admired Greek art and all that. So, and the Greeks were a couple hundred years ahead of the Romans. The problem with Greece, and maybe the reason you don't know that much about it, is the Greek political system couldn't really survive because Greece is a very mountainous country. And so the cities, called the polis is the Greek word for city, there were 200 or 300 of them, and they were all located between mountain ranges. So none of them could be very big. Athens was the biggest city in Greece. It was probably 100,000 maybe back in ancient times. But most of the cities, like Sparta, was like 20,000 people, like a suburb would be today. And because they weren't big, they didn't necessarily think alike, and the Greeks could never get united. Limited by their geography, they could never come together as a people. So when Alexander the Great's father invaded Greece, they were defeated.
And I'm assuming that would be awful for trade as well. So even on an economic level, it would be very difficult. If it's very mountainous, it's hard to, exchange goods and things like that.
Well, except that they're on the Aegean Sea and they did a lot of sea trading. But those would be cities and towns close to the coast, which Athens is right on the water, so that would be good. But like Sparta is in the middle of nowhere. It's got a mountain range on both sides. It's amazing to see.
Were the Spartans really like the greatest warriors of like all history, like the movie 300 makes them out to be?
Yep. That movie's very accurate. I think I answered a question on Quora about that, and so you could look that up if you want. But there's a few tweaks in there that aren't right. Do you remember the movie?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. You remember when Leonidas climbed up in that like cliff thing to talk to these old
The oracles
creepy guys?
or whatever. Yeah, yeah.
Like the witches, basically.
Well, they're called Ephors, and they weren't like that. They were just elected from the Spartan population, so they were regular people. I mean, they did use beautiful drugged women to try and predict the future. That part's true.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
but
crazy.
That's how I'd want to see the future.
Yeah, me too.
but they were not like old and creepy and withered like that, and they weren't like bribable by the Persians, like it's portrayed in the movie. Because Sparta had a very interesting government. They had 2 kings, and then they had a legislature, and then they had a senate, and then they had the Ephors, of which those guys were, and there were five elected officials, and they basically ran the civil government, and the kings ran the army. So,
How much corruption were in these fashions? These small senate and governments that were in the Greece times. Like, was there a lot of corruption?
I don't know. I tend to think that smaller towns have less corruption than bigger ones, because you can't, like, everybody knows everybody. So what can you get away with? Rome had 1 million people, a lot of room for corruption there. So I don't know. I mean, in those days, if you try to get away with stuff and you got caught, you're going to be punished. So I don't know.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, just like our last podcast, we talked about just like we live here in Missouri, and they're trying to pass legislation. And I know this is kind of off topic, but they're trying to pass legislation to where any federal bans on any sort of guns or ammunition or tax increases on it, we wouldn't recognize it as a state. So I don't know. I thought that, like you said, if it's a smaller entity, then more stuff gets done, I guess you could say, or more plausible things.
Well, I mean, I've read where, and I don't know if I think this is for the United States only. I don't know what the world data looks like, but 3% of people commit crimes. And I mean, maybe that's the same throughout history. It's because human society, modern society, is a social construct. It's basically an experiment to see whether a large group of people can get along. And so if you agree to obey the rules of the society, you're fine. But there's some people, a small percentage, that can't do it. And that's just, they're outliers on the continuum of, behavior. And of course, a lot of them can't help it. If you're schizophrenic or whatever, you can't really control your behavior anyway.
This is, like I said, I know we're bouncing around a lot. Another question for you. How, back in Roman times, how did they value education amongst the general population? How important was education to them?
0. Only the rich people got educated.
Because you don't want the lesser people becoming educated and then flipping the script and taking your power away, right?
No, because they didn't have any schools.
Oh, okay.
The rich people, I don't know this absolutely about Rome, but generally speaking, the rich people hired tutors to tutor their kids, and that's how they got educated. And the poor people, learned to speak and write, probably, but that was it. Now, the Greeks actually invented an educational system, but I don't know how much of that came over to Rome. I'm just not knowledgeable about that.
The only reason why I asked that is because I think that it's so undervalued this day and age, education, especially with like young people, like getting a good high school education and being, well informed on things. I think that that's the fundamental core to to any society or civilization is educating people, and because you want smart people, who will eventually run the country when you're old, and they make good decisions. And I think that's fundamental. I was just curious if they valued that back then, because that's probably my biggest value when it comes to the progression of the society that we live in, is educating young people and giving them as many opportunities as humanly possible to figure out their talents and what they're good at, and and just becoming the best version of themselves, mentally and all that. So I was just curious about that.
But that's interesting, because you mentioned before about somebody did about the Electoral College. I think the Electoral College is a safety net, really, and the left doesn't like it because there's situations where they can win the popular vote, and so that's what they want the system to be based on. But the problem with the popular vote is,
not everybody's educated.
Yeah, and not making good decisions.
There's a lot of people who get picked up and get a bottle of whiskey and a ride to the voting booth, and they're given a ballot and they're told how to vote. And and that's an extreme case, and I'm not saying that's rampant, but in my opinion, anybody that votes and doesn't know anything about the candidates is a worthless vote.
Absolutely. I've never thought about that before, but I agree with you.
Just go in and put an X by a name that sounds good to you, and you don't know either candidate. What is that accomplishing?
Absolutely nothing. You could be perpetuating really bad things at that point.
And the framers had an enormous problem with this, because one of the reasons the Constitutional Convention was organized is because the year before, in 1786, something happened called Shays' Rebellion. And basically it was mob rule, where a mob took over part of Connecticut. And so people were killed, and then the militia had to be brought in to put the revolt down and stuff like that. And basically it started because this was a citizen group that objected to some law. I don't know if it was whiskey taxes or I forget. But that scared the hell out of the founders, because they kept talking about this business of too much democracy. If you give the people too much power, it's uncontrolled. Not only if they don't know what they're talking about, but they can fall under the control of people who seek power. If you give 1,000 people $100 and tell them how to vote, you've now vote for you, for example, you've influenced inappropriately the outcome of the election.
Well, and a lot of the liberals have the majority of the population, like in California and New York, and where the large populations are. So it'd be a left president every time if we did popular vote.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some concerns that the Republicans will eventually become unelectable, because the country, I talked about the tribes. The tribes are collecting in the East Coast, the West Coast, and then everybody else in the middle. So California, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, or Virginia are all very left, and basically the center of the country, where you are and where I am, are more conservative. But there are fewer electoral votes, and there are fewer people.
And I think this stems from the 60s and 70s, whenever the liberals won the culture war, to where it is now the progressive thing to be liberal, and kind of that mentality to where if you're not liberal, you're not on the cutting edge, and you're not progressive. And it's almost kind of shut down. Like liberals are very, you can be very proud to be a liberal. They're very outspoken. It's almost like if you're a Republican and you have a Republican view, you almost can't be as vocal. I think Republicans end up getting, or conservatives end up getting a lot more ridicule, because they're not. If what I'm saying makes sense, hopefully,
cool.
they won
it's
the culture
cool
war.
To be liberal. It's cool to be liberal right now in today's,
Yeah.
Well, conservative speakers cannot speak on college campuses now. They get shouted down.
Oh yeah, there's no way. Good luck.
Which is ironic, since the left, which formed itself during the Vietnam War, fought for the freedom of speech that they now prevent the right from having. It's tremendously ironic.
It's completely flipped, and especially as of the past decade, because I was very, very liberal in my mindset from like the ages of 16 when I was actually able to put a thought together, which took about 16 years of my life before I was able to think even remotely clearly about issues, up until about like 24. And then I started realizing that it's, holy shit, now it's going back the other way almost as what I viewed so much. And then now I almost see it as being partially oppressive. Not entirely, but some of it where the liberal side has gone. So
I don't think it always has been, though. I think it's become.
Yeah, no, it's just very recent.
It has become oppressive in the last
very recent
decade, the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Yes, last 10 years, I agree.
Almost like an Orwellian state. I mean, is that accurate in any way?
I wouldn't say that, but I mean, so like I think I'm more liberal than both of you. I think you're probably. I mean, I think we're all middle ground for the most part.
Yes.
But like I'm more liberal than Paul and Jesse here. But I still 100% agree that right now liberals, like that we've said this last decade, it has gotten very, very just oppressive. And like, if you're not with us, you're wrong, when it shouldn't be that way.
Right.
This what is it? The social justice warrior types. That's yeah.
Yep.
Well, we're a little bit over an hour now, so I mean, I don't want to keep you too much longer, Mike. I just had one quick last question for you. You said you've traveled. Like, where all have you traveled to? Like, have you traveled to Mesopotamia, like ancient Iraq and stuff like that, or is it just specifically the Rome side?
No, I've been in Rome, Italy 3 times, and I've been in Greece once. But I went to when I was in Rome, I visited the Forum, obviously, which is kind of the Mecca of Roman history. So if you like Roman history, you want to go there. And I think I mentioned to you, I recorded an audio tour of the Roman Forum, which you guys can listen to. It's available commercially. And it's pretty neat because if you go to the Forum, and you can listen to it without going there, but if you go to the Forum and you buy my tour, it's run by GPS. So as you walk along and you come to a building, then when you get close to it, my voice starts up. And so it explains what that building is. And then as you leave there and go to the next building, same thing happens.
So you don't have to worry about like those crazy guys trying to like get money out of you for like, for a tour and stuff like that. I just have Mike in my pocket ready to go.
Crazy guys. I think they're called tour guides, Paul. But
right.
No, I know.
They're scammers.
You put your phone in your pocket and put an earbud in. Now my tour costs like $5 and the competitive tours are like $75. So it's a very inexpensive option. But the point I'm trying to make is that, the Roman Forum is a wonderful place. You can go in the Senate House and stand in there where the senators spoke and all that. It's just, very moving experience. And then in case of Athens, I stayed in Athens and went to the Acropolis, of course, which is the seat of the ancient Greek government. And then I took a day and I went to Sparta. So spent a day there, and I went to the ancient Spartan city, which was an awesome thing. And then I went to Thermopylae to see where the Battle of 300 took place. And that was a very moving experience too, because that whole, you could imagine the 300 while you were there, and you're on that spot. So it was pretty amazing.
That'd be cool.
And I have a YouTube video. You know how you guys remember the movie? You know how they talk about the hot gates there? The hot gates were a series. There's 3 separate hot springs that come out of the side of the mountain, right where the battle took place. And I posted a YouTube video of the hot gate, one of the hot gates, and where the water's coming out of the mountain and it flows along, and it's hot. You can't put your hand in it. But that's the same place where the battle took place. So it's pretty cool.
I bet it's beautiful out there too.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to go to Greece. I think that'd be dope.
Yeah, just that region in general.
Well, that brings us to like kind of the last very quick thing that I wanted to ask, and I realized that so this question could have a 30-minute answer. I don't want it to. I just want to make it real brief. But like you talking about all this, it makes me. Why should, if you had to briefly explain to someone like why should someone care or be interested in history in general? And I don't mean that to sound demeaning. That wasn't meant to be like. That's very much a like. If you had to explain to the newer generation why they should care about what happened so long ago, what would be your
Well,
thing?
Well, let me preface the answer, though, by saying that it's unfortunate the way history's taught, because the way it's taught, nobody enjoys it.
Oh no,
So,
it's garbage. I can say from personal experience as someone I've moved a lot. I've moved a lot in my life. I went to a ton of different schools, even through high school. I wasn't even at the same high school for very long, multiple high schools. And I literally, as far as history classes were concerned, I've learned about the the Revolutionary War, and that's about it. Like, that is it. I didn't learn about world history and Greece and Egypt. I didn't learn about Vietnam, like none of that. I learned about the Revolutionary War, and that was all. And that's terrible.
Yeah, the problem is that there's too much information to cram in a short period, and that reduces it to names and dates, which have no value because they're not personal. I mean, if you read, I think I told Paul this, if you read history, you realize it's more interesting than the best movie you've ever seen, because you couldn't make up the stuff that happened if you tried. And so there's that. But its value is that you understand humanity, you understand society, you understand what's taken place before that led us to this point, and you also understand, I think this is important, what to be worried about. And I'll give you an example. I have a daughter who's an adult, and she called me one time and told me, it may have been during the 2016 election or just after Trump got elected or something. She told me she was very concerned about all this fighting between the parties and all this, media stuff and all that. And she had no perspective, and if you know American history or even the 20th century, you know that it's been this bad before. So not necessarily the tribalism part, but like during the New Deal period and the Depression and all that, things have been bad. And, I mentioned in my second book that you guys ever heard the term zeitgeist?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Zeitgeist is very real in the sense that it describes the kind of cultural feeling at any one time. And you can say, you guys are too young for this, but there was a zeitgeist in the 60s, which was the anti-war thing. And in the 70s, it was the drug thing. In the 80s, it was the economic thing. In the 90s, it was, I don't know what. But the point is that the spirit of the country tends to last about 10 years or so. And so we're about in a 10-year or 15-year period of this crazy tribalness, and maybe it's going to end.
Well, I feel like we've been on war for a while. I feel like 90s all the way up until current has been about war. But
right. No, but I just mean the tribalism, the left divide. And right controversy. And I speculate in my book about things that could end it. One of the things could end it is everybody realizes it's stupid, but I don't know if that can do it. Another event like 9/11, whatever it is that can unite the country, could end it because it places a priority on something that's more important. The third thing that could end it is if people start talking together and people start taking the middle view and being the bridge between the right and the left to bring sanity back. Those are all things that could happen, and we don't know which one will and when, but I'm optimistic that it will.
Those are beautiful words, Mike. That's a breath of fresh air for me hearing it put like that. That's the future that I want to, is a more united, understanding people that are respectful of other people's opinions and, can start moving forward again and not being so divided.
And let me say one more thing, because somebody mentioned early in the podcast about the media and social media and print media and broadcast media are all, they get huge blame in this, in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion, because they tell stories or present stories that represent extreme points of view because that's what makes them money. It doesn't make sense to talk about the middle it's not interesting. So they talk about, Trump's colluding with the Russians and all that in extreme positions as possible, because then everybody gets on the bandwagon. And that's dangerous. And I mean, I use Twitter. I don't use Facebook that much. Twitter's dangerous because any idiot can be you get your 2 minutes of fame by calling somebody a Nazi on Twitter. And there's no filter. There's no entity that controls that keeps crazy people from being exposed. So then we all hear the extreme all the time. We never hear the normal.
And I think it's really bad that especially my generation and the new generation coming in underneath me, because I'm 28. I'm not old by any means, but there's still this newer generation coming in, and it's the same way with my generation. Is we end up looking up not to scientists, scholars, or professors in colleges. We look up to athletes and actors and reality TV stars, and we're getting their opinions on what society should be.
God, that's all so much of a joke. That's so much of a joke.
It's so true, though. It's so true, and this is not where these generations need to be getting their mentors from. Like, you need to not have the Kardashians being your mentor as far as what life should be like and what morality is and all this, because it's so far. So that's what I one thing I have to say about that is we need to respect scientists. Listen to a scientist. Listen to a philosopher. From the past or something. Not these Hollywood actors and people like that.
Yeah, there's a line in the Progressive Gene where I quote that I saw a list of the 100 most admired people in the United States, and the first 4 were actors.
That's crazy.
Holy smokes. That's creepy.
Yeah, that's a problem. That's definitely a problem.
Well, Mike, where can if people want to look up your stuff, what's your I mean, I know what it is, but I'm saying for YouTube.
I was actually going to say before we let Mike go, I'm going to put a description in the description, links to your blog and to Amazon where they can find your book to purchase your book. That'll all be in the link below whenever I upload the video.
That's what I was.
Okay.
So
that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man. I know you talked about maybe coming on another time to talk about your second book that's coming out, and maybe we could do a whole podcast on the left and right, which I know the first half of this podcast was kind of about, but I think we could.
We left a lot out. We have several more hours to talk about if you guys are up for it.
Oh, for sure, man.
I'd like to
this was a great
I'd honestly
podcast.
like to hear a little more, because like I said, I'm not educated on world history. I'd like to hear more of the ancient history stuff, to be honest, because that's what you know more about. We talked about a lot about how it affects modern day, but I'd still like to, I mean, like capitalism starting up, and I had a question that I never got to ask, and that's fine. We'll move, some other time, about war, and is war required for capitalism to succeed and all this different stuff. But that's, another time.
Maybe if you have time, maybe we could do once a month, but we can talk about that off the air, Mike, and we'll make it happen if you're welcome to come back.
No, I enjoy it. I mean, I appreciate you guys wanting to get different points of view. And I mean, I think you're doing this the right way if you want to push your podcast to a more general audience and grow your followers. I think you're going the right direction.
Well, cool. Thank you very much.
Good to hear. Thanks.
Absolutely. This was extremely enlightening. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed this a lot.
Well, Mike, we'll let you go. You have a good night. Thanks for joining Talk Junkies, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks. See you later.
Have a good one, Mike.
Bye.
Yep.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was Mike Anderson, a blogger, and he has 1 book published. I think maybe 2 now, actually, and he's publishing his 3rd book. Like I said, all the links will be down in the description, so if you guys want to check his stuff out, it'll all be down there. Hopefully, I mean, I enjoyed the podcast. I know.
Yeah.
No, that was really good. That was really good. I was very happy with that conversation. I would actually, I could talk to that guy for 4 hours, man. He's very interesting.
Knows what he's talking about, but very able to also just bring it down to a normal level, where other people can understand it.
Yeah, no, he definitely brought it to layman's terms. Yeah, no, that was a very good podcast.
So shout out, Mike. Thanks again, man. We'll leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. That's Talk Junkies coming at you live from my, or not, I'm just kidding. Not
every
live.
time, bro. It's not live.
But it will be live one day. I think we're hopefully I'm gonna talk to Johnny about it tonight about live streaming some of these podcasts, because then it just takes out a lot of other stuff, the editing aspect and all that. But that's coming in the future. But to all our junkies out there,
stay fly and ring the bell.